Oh, sorry, everyone should have just received the recording in progress message. Please click got it on your screen in order to continue watching today's presentation. Oops, I'm so sorry. So in today's session, we are going to be talking about the assessment of privacy impacts. And it's not as easy as it seems. It's also not useful to talk about assessing privacy impacts before we really understand privacy and how to identify personal information. So that's the first part of today's discussion. The second part of today's discussion is an overview of the privacy impact assessment process at Gippsland PHN. And for those of you who are not aware, part of IIS's engagement has been to develop two types of templates for Gippsland PHN. One is a privacy threshold assessment template, and the other is a privacy impact assessment template. Now, these two things really will assist you in terms of your privacy program management over time. And we're going to talk you through a case study on how to use those templates effectively. So first, let's understand privacy and the identification of personal information. But before we get into the meat and bones of the discussion, I think it's really important for me as an educator to get a feel for what the room thinks privacy is about. So my assistant Della is going to pop a poll up now onto your LinkedIn feed, and we're going to ask you to answer a question. What do you think privacy is about? In this particular poll question, you can only choose from one of the answers. So please choose the one that seems to fit best from your perspective. I'll give everyone about 30 seconds or so to answer the question, and then we'll move on. So the answers are that privacy is about being free from unnecessary intrusion into one's personal life, or to keep data secret and hidden, or to protect personal information in accordance with the law and community expectations, or to be left alone, or to secure information generally from misuse and unauthorized access, disclosure, and modification. I'm going to choose an answer as well. We'll just give you guys a couple of more minutes to do that, a couple more seconds to do that, and we'll see what the poll results are. So again, this is finding out what you think privacy is about. I often find as an educator that it helps to really, let the message settle if we understand where everyone in the room is coming from first. And then you, come around to my way of thinking in terms of what privacy is about. So interestingly, the matter of securing information was what most of the room feel that privacy is about. And next, then, it was protecting personal information in accordance with the law and community expectations. All right, well, with that in mind, I'd like to take you through, a bit of a potted history of what privacy is. Now, privacy is founded in our civil liberties. So the concepts like the right to be let alone and the right to be free from intrusion in our personal lives. And to understand what those civil liberties mean, it's important to put them in context. So if you look at the tiles on the screen in front of you, you'll see first that there's a gentleman standing there in a bubble. And this tile is to represent something called territorial privacy. And territorial privacy is the idea that we each have a bubble or a space that we occupy, whether that's the immediate space around ourselves, or it's ourselves in an elevator traveling from floor to floor, or it's ourselves in our homes or driving in our car. Territorial privacy is the idea that when we're in the space that we're occupying, we don't wish to be observed during that private time or in that private space. We wish to be free from unnecessary intrusion into that space. And then a way of exemplifying this is, when you go home at night after work and you close your door and you shut the blinds and you switch on the TV and you pour yourself a glass of wine, you have the expectation in that moment that no one's watching what you're doing. No one's taking notes about what you're doing. So you can thereby go about your private life without interference. Another tile on the screen shows a Vitruvian man and woman, and this is to signify something called bodily privacy, and sometimes people refer to that as health privacy. Now, that's the privacy of the information that's contained within ourselves or on ourselves. And an example of this might be our DNA. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever attended or, bought one of those DNA kits from, say, ancestry.com or another one of those the ancestry providers, and done the cheek swab and sent it away for genetic analysis, and then you find that you're matched with different people, family members all over the world and relatives. Now, what's really interesting about this is that in order to find out where we come from or where we belong, many people are willing to trade away the information, the most central and pivotal information about themselves, and that is our DNA. So that's an example of health privacy or bodily privacy. Then we move to the tile there that looks like a bunch of devices and symbols associated with communicating. Now, communications privacy is the notion that we have the ability or the right to choose what we communicate, how we communicate it, and to whom we communicate it, and using whichever medium we like. Now, we have an expectation in those instances, whether it's sending email, for example, or sending a piece of snail mail through the general post, that what we are choosing to communicate is not going to be interrupted or intercepted and read by someone else or given regard to by someone else in the circumstance. And then all of those three types of privacy kind of get lumped into this final tile, which has the individual there with the information sign. That is information privacy. Now, information privacy is the information about you and about me that relates to things like our identity and other things that can be known about us. And based on the examples that I've given you up to this point, you can see that territorial privacy or health or bodily privacy or communications privacy can all really be subsumed into that one category. Now, what's interesting about all of this, though, is that everyone has a different threshold, right? A different benchmark for what they consider to be private in their personal lives. So it kind of makes privacy hard. So what do we do about that? How do we translate these civil liberties, these rights, these expectations, and these, varying understandings of what privacy means in a context? How do we translate that into some kind of consistent action as organizations? Well, we create laws. So our rights and freedoms can be codified, right, to help us understand and manage expectations of the community in a consistent way, in a way that we can replicate again and again. And we do this by following laws like the Commonwealth Privacy Act or various state and territory privacy laws. In our case today, we have the Health Records Act in Victoria, as well as other laws that will apply to privacy in a context. So, for example, we have education legislation, child safety legislation, and surveillance legislation. And all of those types of legislation may deal with the topic of privacy in some way. Often we see those other laws deal with privacy using other terms like confidentiality or secrecy. And there's an important distinction here, and just going back to the poll results for a second, where we were talking about privacy and what it means to each and every one of you, or what you think it is. And security really featured highly there. And I just want to differentiate between the concepts of privacy and security. And I suppose a simplistic way to do this is to think about privacy as the protection of personal information, right? That's the information about you and about me that could identify us or lead to us being identified. That's privacy. Security is something altogether different. It's the controls that we put in place to put a fence around any information, which could include personal information, but isn't exclusive to personal information. So getting to the rub of today's discussion though, why is privacy important for Gippsland PHN? And, sometimes it's a tough question. Often, when I'm in a room full of people, someone will raise their hand and they'll say, well, because the law says it has to be important to us, right? There's a compliance obligation. But privacy is actually a lot bigger than that. And So it's important to look at things like the value proposition, right? So Gippsland PHN has patients and consumers that provide personal information in exchange for the provision of health services, right? So at some stage in your work, you are going to be provided, whether directly or through some intermediary, the personal information of members of the community. And when that happens, it's important to understand that what the community is getting out of that exchange or that giving of their personal information needs to stack up in value for them. Otherwise, what happens is that there becomes a imbalance of power where Gippsland PHN has all the information, can gather all the information that it needs for its functions, but the community is not getting much out of that. And usually the trade-off is around trust. So keep that in mind in terms of that value proposition for the community that you serve. It's also important to remember that as part of your functions, Gippsland PHN collects and uses significant amounts of personal information of patients and consumers, and also from health service suppliers and staff, right? So there's a lot of that type of information, and privacy can provide some pretty significant guardrails in terms of what happens to that information through its life cycle. It's important to remember too that as staff, you handle personal information on a daily basis, right? It might not always be personal information of the community, for example. It might be personal information that's related to a contact person in a supplier arrangement, or it might be personal information of a staff member. And finally, you are subject to a number of different privacy regimes in the PHN, and that can make things a bit confusing, right? So if you only think about privacy in terms of compliance, what if you miss something? So it's important to ensure that your guardrails are as broad as possible so that you interpret as broadly and inclusively, I suppose, as possible, the rights of consumers and staff and others who are providing their personal information to the PHN. You interpret that broadly, and then you interpret your rights as an organization narrowly in terms of what happens to that personal information. And you'll see what I mean as I carry on in today's discussion. But probably more important than the discussion about value proposition or kind of what's in it for the PHN is understanding what personal information is, right? We're going to talk about this topic a lot today. And unless we really know what we're talking about, it's kind of hard to go further with privacy risk assessment. So personal information can be defined as follows. It's information that identifies an individual, that's a living person, or could reasonably lead to the identification of an individual. Personal information is about a natural living person. So in some places around the world, privacy rights attach to people who are deceased, not so here. And personal information is technology neutral, and it's not medium specific. What I mean by that is that personal information doesn't have to be something that's gathered in a particular way or gathered via a particular technology. It doesn't necessarily have to look the way that you would expect, like something written down in a document. Personal information can also be an opinion. It can be numbers. It can be letters. It can be sort of alphanumeric code. It can be pictures. It can be things like body samples or DNA. So personal information is quite encompassing. It's also important to note that not all data is personal information. So, you know, there's a lot of data that you'll deal with as part of the PHN, and you'll deal with statistics, for example. But if something doesn't identify an individual or have the ability to reasonably lead to them being identified, it's likely that that information is not personal, even if it's potentially derived from something personal. And again, we can talk about this a little further as we go through the discussion. So I'm just going to give you a couple of examples of what personal information could include, just to kind of get the concept marinating for you. So within the PHN, you're going to see things like name and date of birth. You're going to see contact information, health information, most certainly, physical appearance, location information, financial details. You may also see information about a person's ethnicity or their education or profession, varying types of communications or social interactions, So for example, if there is communication with an individual via social media, that is personal information. The opinions, for example, that they express as attached to their identity, that's personal information. Things like an IP address are also personal information. Thoughts, beliefs, opinions, criminal record, and sexual preferences and practices. So I'm talking a lot of things can be personal information depending on the context. And again, linking back to that ability to identify a person. Now, there are certain types of personal information or categories. So when you look at our privacy laws, what you see is a definition of personal information, and then you see some subcategories for personal information. And the subcategories of personal information often attract a greater degree of protection in terms of what the law says can happen to them in a particular context. So one subset of personal information is something called sensitive information. And sensitive information includes the kinds of things that you would expect if you think about what's sensitive to you, right? What's sensitive to you as an individual, chances are the law has prescribed a degree of sensitivity to that information as well. So health information is an example of sensitive information, as well as information about race and ethnicity, religious beliefs, sexual preferences and practices, and criminal history. Genetic information, as well as biometric information and templates. And what I mean by biometric information are things like fingerprints, iris scans, face prints. So facial recognition systems, for example, collect biometric information about a person. Now, from sensitive information, there's yet another subset, which is health information. And I touched on that just before, but what exactly does health information include? And this is particularly relevant to the PHN. It's information about an individual's physical or mental health or disability, about their health service preferences. So for example, do they wish to be treated in a public setting or a private setting? What's the nature of the services that have been or are about to be provided to them? The information that's collected in the course of providing the health service itself, and human tissue donation information, again, as well as genetic information. So look, I think there's a fair bit here that we've just covered. So the time is right, I think, to do another poll and recap what we've just learned. So based on what I talked about in terms of what personal information is, as well as those subsets, what information is likely from your perspective to be personal information? Now, there are opportunities here to answer more than one answer. So in this question, we have name, a hospital's expense information, mental health record notes, the name of a health practice, an individual's opinion about a health service that's been provided, information about a person's visit to the PHN website, and information about a person's ethnic background. Which of these things do you think are likely to be personal information? I'll just give you another 20 seconds or so to answer, and then we will move on into those other subsets or categories that I've discussed. And I'm answering mine too. Here we are. And how did we go, Della? Okay, that's really interesting. So we have everyone got name. That's fantastic. And mental health record notes, yes. Well, let's go through these and see. So name, yes. Personal information. A hospital's expense information. No, the hospital's expenses, no. The expenses incurred on behalf of an individual, yes. Mental health record notes, definitely. The name of the health practice, now that's a really interesting one, because if the name of the health practice is tied to the individual, i.e. an individual visited a particular allied health provider, for example, or visited a particular hospital. So if that information is in context, an individual's opinion about a health service provided, yes. information about a person's visit to the website, of course, because remember, IP address as well as a person's browsing patterns while they're on your website definitely constitute personal information. And then finally, yes. So what I'm going to do for the sake of the next question is just to take out what we know or what we'd say is not generally going to be personal information, so that we can then delve down into what of these items is potentially sensitive information. So of these multiple choice answers, which of the above are now potentially sensitive information? So we have name, mental health record notes, an individual's opinion about a health service provided, information about a person's visit to the website, and information about a person's ethnic background. Now, although we've excluded, of course, answers 2 and answer 4, it's important to remember that potentially in context, so potentially in the context of all of the other information, that information might be considered sensitive to the person, but as defined under law, financial records of the hospital, as well as the name of a health practice, would not necessarily be considered sensitive, although it would be sensitive potentially to the individual in context. Okay, and we'll just wait for Della to tabulate those results, and we'll see where we've all landed. Okay, well, I think this is really encouraging. Now, remembering, and it might be hard to harken back to that definition of sensitive information, but remember, it's a subset of the definition of personal information in privacy law. So we're not talking right now about what we as individuals think would be sensitive. We're talking about what is sensitive under law. So I'll just take you through it. A name is not sensitive, not considered sensitive information in terms of the definition of personal information. However, those mental health record notes certainly are. An individual's opinion about a health service provided certainly could be, depending on the nature of the health service or that particular interaction. Information about a person's visit to the website is not sensitive information. However, information about a person's ethnicity most certainly is. Now, flowing on from this, if we've excluded what isn't sensitive and what isn't personal information, what's likely to be health information? Remembering that health information is a subset of personal information. So we have mental health notes and an individual's opinion about a health service provided, and information about a person's gender identity. I'll just do my answers, and then we'll wait for Della to tabulate the results. Now, you guys are not meant to get all of this right. What this is intended to do is get you thinking about the quantity and depth potentially of personal information that you're dealing with in the PHN. Some of it which may be considered sensitive under law, and some of it which may be defined as health information under law. So how did we go with these ones, Della? Yes, fantastic. So let's go through these answers. Mental health notes absolutely are considered health information. An individual's opinion about health services provided. And again, this is because the definition of health information extends to the health services provided. And finally, information about a person's gender identity. What does everyone think? I would say in the case of most PHN interactions with personal information, if a person's gender identity is, say, attached to a health service provider, perhaps a person is transitioning, then you could certainly say that the nature of the person's gender identity is health information in the context. All right, so let's talk about privacy law for a minute, and I'll try not to belabor this because we don't want today's session to be all about compliance. We're just trying to give you a taster for the legal environment that you're operating in. So the Privacy Act 1988 is a Commonwealth legislation that the PHN is required to comply with. It contains 13 Australian privacy principles, and these principles set out the requirements for handling personal information, through its life cycle. And these include principles around collection, use, storage, security, and disclosure of personal information. And they also establish a person's right to seek access to or correction of their own personal information. The rules also around anonymity and a person's ability to complain about the handling of their personal information are set out in Commonwealth privacy law. And the APPs, or those Australian privacy principles, they contain stricter rules for the collection and handling of sensitive information. And remember, we've just gone through that definition of personal information and the subsets of sensitive and health information. Now, health information in Commonwealth privacy law is defined as a subset to sensitive information. Now, we also have the Health Records Act of 2001 in Victoria that the PHN is also required to comply with. So this is what I was talking about, being subject to multiple regimes. And it can be quite confusing, because if you're looking at sort of that primary privacy law being the Commonwealth law, it's sometimes hard to know if all of the rules match up in your particular contexts. So you have also 11 health-specific privacy principles that the PHN is required to comply with, and they set out stricter requirements for the collection and handling of health information. So what you see now is this kind of this complementary or parallel regime at work, where you've got the guardrails that the Commonwealth privacy law sets around the collection and handling of any personal information, and then you have the health-specific principles in Victoria. So we're about now to move into our discussion about privacy impact assessment, and I'll take you through an overview and some steps for doing that. But I can see that there has been a bit of activity in the chat. So now's the time, please, Liz, if there are any questions, I'm really happy to answer them.
Yeah, I'm not sure if one of the questions is a facetious question or not. What is an unnatural living person? So when we refer to,
right.
Yeah.
Right. So unfortunately, the way things work in privacy law, which is probably why I'm trying not to dwell on it too much, is you get mired in definitions. So what happens is that privacy legislation defines personal information being about an individual. And then you have to go to something called the Acts Interpretation Act to find out what the word individual means. And in that piece of legislation, individual is defined as a natural living person. Absolutely not. We're not talking about zombies in this case. And it is sort of a vagary of the way that the laws are written. But the point there was to identify for you that health privacy legislation and privacy legislation generally doesn't attach rights, privacy rights, to people who are deceased. Now, that's not to say that decisions can't be made that provide for privacy protections for people who are deceased. So in certain circumstances, such as where we're talking about information of deceased individuals who are Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, we may make decisions that are conscious of those cultures and ensure that we do what we can to preserve those cultural norms and mores when we're dealing with information of deceased people, for example. Similarly, where we're talking about archives contexts, right? There is certain information that, while privacy rights might not attach to information in a sort of organizational decision-making context, they may actually attach in an archiving context, depending on the nature of the information. So it's actually quite a complicated area, and not one that we really need to delve too deeply into today, but it's certainly one that is it's just worth knowing that privacy in the context we're talking about is about natural living people.
Just one more question, Nicole, before you go on to part two, and it is about a person who might have died by suicide, which is a really relevant question for us. We do see coronial data at times. So could you comment on if a person has died by suicide, they're no longer living, and how does that apply then?
Well, so there may be other legislation. So if you receive information that is through a coronial process or an inquest process, there may be requirements on you in terms of confidentiality or secrecy in relation to that information. So some other regime may apply on top of the privacy rules. Now, the thing to remember about most privacy laws is that they are subject to other laws. So where, for example, a child safety legislation may apply to some information, or in the case of someone who's died by suicide, if that was a child as an example, there may be a whole bunch of other legislation that impacts your decision making. So you follow those rules first, and then the privacy principles come in and pick up the slack. So I hope that answers the question.
Thanks.
Okay. So what I'll do then is I'll move into our overview of the privacy impact assessment process and the steps that are required to be taken. So before we go there, just as a matter of interest, what do you guys think a privacy impact assessment is? Are you not sure? Have you never heard of it? Do you think, I mean, if you're in tech and data, if you're in that space, often we hear that a privacy impact assessment is a hindrance to project development and execution. So is that what you think it is? Do you think it's not relevant to most staff? It's an assessment completed by the privacy champion. Is it an assessment to ensure compliance with legal privacy obligations? Or is it a way for the PHN to demonstrate best privacy practice and protect the privacy of community members and stakeholders? So in this case, we can only answer once, but it's definitely important, again, to gauge, to allow me to read the room a little bit in terms of how we're pitching our discussion going forward. Now, I can say to you, just anecdotally, while Della's tabulating the results, that we do a lot of privacy impact assessments at IIS Partners, and often when those privacy impact assessments relate to technology or data projects, data analysis, or even integration projects, there can be a perception that this type of work is intended to be a roadblock, right? So when we get called in, people think, oh no, here comes the Office of No, here comes, the drag on progress. And I'm here to assure you that that's not actually the case. So Della, what did the room say? Aha. So, and this is actually good. Nobody thought it was a hindrance, or maybe you're just being polite. I mean, that's fine too. So we have that it's an assessment to ensure compliance with privacy obligations, or that it's an opportunity to demonstrate best practice. So what is a privacy impact assessment defined as then? Well, the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner, so that's the regulator that is in charge of observing agency compliance with that Commonwealth Privacy Act of 1988, they say that a privacy impact assessment is a systematic assessment of a project that identifies the impact that the project might have on the privacy of individuals and sets out recommendations for managing, minimizing, or eliminating that impact. So a privacy impact assessment is kind of right there in between those last two answers, where everybody or most of you fell in terms of what a privacy impact assessment is. And it's actually great to see that, because there's a clear understanding that compliance obligations are one thing, but demonstrating an ongoing pattern culturally as an organization of best practice when it comes to privacy is also incredibly important. Okay, so why do we conduct a privacy impact assessment? Well, we do it because there are benefits for us as an organization, right? The first is that we're being compliant with privacy law. The last thing that we want is, that the scrutiny of a privacy regulator, because we failed to assess for privacy impacts and therefore failed to mitigate or minimize those. It allows for a degree of stakeholder confidence in Gippsland PHN privacy practices. Now, whenever we're in that health space and whenever we're dealing with personal information, you can't underestimate stakeholder confidence, right? And stakeholders are not just the community that you serve. Stakeholders are other practices, there's service providers, staff members are stakeholders as well. It's really important that those stakeholders have confidence in privacy practices, because then they know that, hey, we're in a place where we're dealing with a PHN that gets it. Now, it's also, I think, important to acknowledge that one of the benefits is the reduction of potential future costs in time and expenses and other resources. And I say this not just because of the cost of non-compliance, right? I mean, we've all heard of things like privacy breaches or data breaches arising because a privacy impact assessment wasn't done. Yeah, there's a cost there, but what I'm talking about is where you invest heavily in a project or initiative or process or whatever it is that you're doing. You invest heavily in terms of time and staff hours and money and other resources. And then you find down the track that privacy is actually a showstopper, whether it's a showstopper for a regulator or for the community that you serve, or there's just that sort of impact on trust. And so people aren't really getting on board with your project. You've got future costs there in terms of trying to retrofit privacy then. And there's a saying when we talk about something called privacy by design, which is that it's so much better to build privacy in at the outset, right? Mitigate those risks at the outset than it is to have to bolt it on later, because that can be quite expensive. Privacy impact assessments also promote staff awareness, and you can't underestimate staff awareness either. So as you go through a privacy impact assessment process, you involve many different staff members in that the teasing out or the understanding of potential privacy risks, as well as how to address them. And through that involvement, through those discussions, what you do is you elevate everyone's understanding of things like, what personal information are we talking about here? How are we going to be using it? Who is it about, and who could our project impact? I mean, these are all really important questions around privacy. And if all staff are kind of on the same page in terms of that assessment, it can be quite a powerful learning tool, and also down the track, quite a powerful compliance tool. And finally, coming back to that concept of trust, it does build trust with the community. So if you do a privacy impact assessment or go through that process, and perhaps you decide to publish your executive summaries of those privacy impact assessments, say, hey, we've done 5, 10, or 12 privacy impact assessments. These are the projects that they're about. And these were the risks that we identified, and this is how we addressed them. That kind of information put out in the public domain can be a really incredible trust building tool. So those are all the benefits, right? But okay, what are the risks? What are the risks of not conducting a privacy impact assessment? And we have to talk about those risks, because often when it comes to projects and initiatives that have, say, executive support or buy-in, or where significant resources have already been deployed for those projects, oftentimes there's a temptation in a project management setting just to kind of set privacy aside, because it can sometimes feel like a really hard thing to move with. And it can feel like a hurdle or a roadblock or some hoop you have to jump through that's just time consuming and challenging. But if you don't conduct a privacy impact assessment, there's the real risk of non-compliance with the law. And I can tell you with certainty that, particularly in terms of the Victorian privacy regulators' interest in privacy impact assessments, it's so much better to do them and understand where your risks are and do your utmost to mitigate those risks, and to be seen to have done that by the regulator, than to ignore it altogether and be considered potentially by the regulator as non-compliant. There's also the potential significant loss of resources in the event of a privacy breach. So do you remember way back the beginning of today's session, we talked about what privacy means, and a number of you answered, it's about securing any information. It's about securing information. Well, when it comes to a privacy breach, we're not just talking about a data breach, right? So a breach of systems where data is authorized in an, or accessed in an unauthorized way, or disclosed or lost. And where that data is personal, it's particularly significant, right? We're not just talking about that. When we talk about privacy breach, we're talking about a failure to comply in a meaningful way with any of the privacy principles that relate to collection, use, storage, security, and disclosure of personal information. There's also the risk to Gippsland PHN's reputation, right? So it's brand damaging. If a privacy impact assessment is not done and the project is significant or raises significant privacy concerns for the community or staff members or other stakeholders, you can damage your brand, and folks are not going to want to deal with you or participate in your project. And that's not a good thing when we're talking about, a holistic engagement space such as the one that the PHN is trying to develop. And that flowing from that, of course, is the notion that there are lost opportunities because stakeholders may hold ongoing concerns. Now, whether they're real concerns or perceived concerns, there they are. And there can be a layer then of mistrust, across all of those relationships. And that causes, sort of a dysfunctional relationship with stakeholders and a real challenge in getting projects meaningfully off the ground. In addition to sort of the pros and cons, right? There is the bigger picture, though, that at Gippsland PHN, there's a large body of governance work going on to ensure that the PHN makes good decisions. And making good decisions in respect of personal information means applying privacy guardrails in a consistent and replicable way again and again, no matter what the projects are, no matter what the initiatives are. It's also really important, I think, to come back to that early discussion that we had, where I was saying, look, everyone has a different threshold in terms of what privacy means to them. Well, maybe that's actually an okay starting point, that if we're thinking about privacy impact assessments as an opportunity to serve the community through good decision making, we also can look at them as an opportunity to say, wow, if this was my personal information that was involved in this project that I'm doing, how would I like to see it managed through its life cycle? What would my threshold be for that? And I know, it's maybe not always the best litmus test, but it's a good one, particularly for some of those data or technology projects. And when I move into the case study, you'll see exactly what I mean. It's also important in terms of good decision making to think about risk, not just in terms of compliance risk. And I know that this would be something that comes up in a governance context across a whole lot of other spaces. So for example, workplace health and safety, or freedom from bullying or harassment in the workplace. Often when we think of risk, we think of risk to the organization, right? So non-compliance presents a risk to the organization of being seen as not complying, right? And that's not a good look from a regulatory perspective. I want you to expand that thinking and think about what's the risk of a privacy harm to the individual. So when we're going about our business and we are looking at projects or initiatives or processes or procedures or anything of the like, are we thinking about what the outcome will be for the person? So often we think compliance risk is, for example, we have a privacy breach, and the privacy breach means that we're under the scrutiny of the regulator, and that maybe we have to pay a fine, and that maybe we have some brand damage. Okay, I get that. But what if that privacy breach results in an emotional or a financial harm to the individual? Or what if the harm is simply exposure of the individual, exposure of the fact that they were the recipient of a particular type of health service, or that they were engaged, within the health services environment in a particular context? Maybe that exposure harm is enough to cause real damage to that person. So do keep that in mind. And I guess where I'm going with all of this is that the privacy risk assessment process for Gippsland PHN that is being implemented now is all about getting there safely and, managing your projects from end to end in a way that shows that you make good decisions and, is a safer, more attractive option for the PHN. Okay, so in accordance with Office of the Australian Information Commissioner guidance, Gippsland PHN undertakes privacy impact assessments for all projects that involve personal information. So that's the policy stance of the PHN. And it's important to know this because sometimes it's not always easy to know which projects do involve personal information. So we're going to take you through that. The privacy impact assessment program, or risk assessment program, includes 3 ways of helping you to get through this. One is that there is a privacy impact assessment procedure, and that is what stipulates, the steps that you need to take in order to give effect to that policy position that you just do PIAs here. This is what we do here. The procedure sets out that there is a privacy threshold assessment process and checklist, and where the threshold assessment meets the criteria for doing a privacy impact assessment, then there is an internal privacy impact assessment template that staff can refer to. So let's talk about the privacy impact assessment steps. And I'll go through this in much greater detail in the case study because that'll make it make sense. Right now, it's probably just gobbledygook to everybody, but there are some important steps. The first is, look, you decide to do a project. And, honestly, in the PHN, many or most of your projects are going to involve personal information or data that is derived from personal information in some way. So let's keep that in mind. There is a threshold assessment process for you to determine then if a privacy impact assessment is required. And the privacy impact assessment template includes a number of steps before you're able to go ahead with that particular project or initiative. And where things get tricky, it's not always going to be easy for PHN staff to go through a privacy impact assessment, particularly if, it's a project that actually identifies some fairly troublesome privacy risks or potentially troublesome privacy risks. There is also the option within your PIA procedure to conduct an external privacy impact assessment. And then finally, as you've gone through all of these different steps, you ultimately come to the implementation of the recommendations and actions that you identify through the privacy impact assessment process. And there's a bit of a feedback loop that happens there because a PIA is not sort of a set and forget thing. And I know it's tempting to think that it is, but a privacy impact assessment is a snapshot in time of a particular project or an initiative. And it's always important to check back to make sure that recommendations have been implemented and to see if any details of the project or the initiative have changed, which might necessitate going through the process again. So now at the PHN, whose job is it to conduct privacy impact assessments? Well, the project manager and teams that are involved in projects, it's your job, but you do have support. So there is a privacy champion within the PHN, and that's the Data Governance, Ethics, and Research Group. So the privacy champion isn't one person, it is instead the group. Now, this is actually really quite wonderful for everyone because what it means is there's actually lots of hearts and minds already that are focused on privacy and getting it right within the PHN, which gives you that additional layer or level of support and confidence at the project level in order to get this work done. So before we move into part 3, which is our case study, I do have about 5 minutes allocated for questions if any have come up in the chat, Liz.
There aren't any in the chat, but please, anyone can add one while I ask this question, perhaps if I can, Nicole. You mentioned, the flow chart that was on the previous slide suggested that there could be a time where you might do an external privacy impact assessment. And I wondered if you could comment on the kinds of considerations for that, that scenario.
Right. So one of the greatest considerations, Liz, would be if if you feel as an organization that the project or the initiative is likely to raise significant concerns with the community that you serve. And the privacy threshold assessment does actually help you to identify that. And it does become a little bit of a question about what the risk appetite of the PHN is. You know, if you think that there may be significant concern in the community, but you're happy to deal with privacy in-house and quietly, that's a decision for the organization. But oftentimes, in order to ensure that a project gets legs, that the resources that have been spent on that project are not wasted, having an external body come in and do that work and give you that objective, independent eyeball over the whole project and provide you with recommendations that are not actually tied to the outcomes of the project necessarily, you know, like on all the different internal stakeholder relationships, which can sometimes happen with internal privacy impact assessments. You get that broader external look that then project teams in some ways may feel that, okay, we can trust this external privacy impact assessment because it's been done by somebody who has no stake in the outcome. And so that's a really important thing to consider. External privacy impact assessments, though, they require something that often privacy doesn't get from a project perspective, which is budget. So at the privacy threshold assessment stage, which we'll talk about in a moment with this case study, it's really important to consider whether you need to add to your budget for privacy, or whether you're happy to run the gauntlet of doing the work internally, without giving that additional budget to privacy and potentially having that community concern remain present for you. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you. And there are no other questions, so let's get cracking. Thanks, Nicole.
That's great. And I'm just trying to move my my little cursor here so that I can see a little bit more of what I'm looking at here, because it's a tiny bit complicated. Okay, so our case study is about a project that the PHN would like to do. And it's the health planning research and evaluation team that are proposing this project. And it's about installing Wi-Fi at the Gippsland PHN head office that can be freely accessed by the community. So you will have seen this type of thing in other contexts, like you see, you know, the municipalities that you live in may have free public Wi-Fi, or you can go into a fast food joint and access free public Wi-Fi, or a shopping mall and access free public Wi-Fi, an airport, etc. Right? So there are lots of different places where this type of technology is offered, and Gippsland PHN would like to do the same. And the HPRE team consider that the project would encourage more community members to attend the head office location and participate in community engagement activities. And we certainly know from our discussions with Liz that this is an important objective of the PHN, is to ensure that your community comes with you, comes on the journey with you. This is a particularly relevant space when we talk about the healthcare settings. So it's proposed, the project team are proposing that users will be required to set up an account to access the Wi-Fi, and then they'll log into the Wi-Fi using their account. So this is our scenario. So we've got a scenario, right? We've got a project proposal. We've got the initiation of the project phase. And this is where it can kind of get interesting, right? Because most projects at that proposal stage, what do? You write up your project proposal and you tend to send it off for approval. And the privacy impact assessment process is saying, you have steps to go through before you go and you get that project approval, right? You're initiating your project, or maybe it's not project approval so much as you've got steps to go through that are complementary to the project approval process. So at project initiation, you need to ask two very important questions, and the privacy threshold assessment checklist helps you step through this. Does the project involve personal information? And if you think back to our earlier discussion of what personal information is, remember that personal information can also include sensitive information, and sensitive information includes health information. So there is a broad amount of information here about individuals that could be at stake. So if the project involves personal information, you must move to the privacy threshold assessment checklist. Okay. And will the project cause worry or concern in the community? So maybe your project doesn't involve personal information, but it involves information derived of personal information. So for example, it involves health sector statistics or de-identified or aggregate data that you have harvested from personal information that you already have within the PHN. Maybe though there's potential for the use of that information to cause worry or concern in the community, even if on the face of it, it doesn't directly identify a person or a group of people. If that is the case, you should also go through step 1, which is completing the privacy threshold assessment checklist. This is really important because it lends a level of defensibility to your decisions. Remember, I was talking earlier about good decision making and how privacy risk assessment allows you to demonstrate that you have made good decisions and allows the PHN to achieve its projects and its goals safely. So in the case of our scenario, does the project involve personal information? Well, yes, because the proposal is that users of the proposed free public Wi-Fi are going to set up an account. And to do that, setting up an account does require the inclusion of particular types of personal information, such as, perhaps an individual's name, an email address, potentially other identifying details. Will the project cause worry or concern in the community? Potentially not. There probably is a project that would be welcomed by the community, but nevertheless, the fact that it involves personal information is enough to trigger the privacy assessment process. So then we get into the privacy threshold assessment checklist. And within the checklist, and these documents exist separately, right? It's not just this little flow chart that you see here. They're actually formal documentation that you will all have access to that will make these steps make a little bit more sense. So through the privacy threshold assessment process, you've determined that you think your project involves personal information, right? So say name, email address, potentially even like an IP address of the potential user. And the threshold assessment checklist helps you to determine that it is or that it isn't personal information in the context. It also helps you to set out or determine what will happen to the personal information and whether or not there are significant privacy risks associated with that. So we've answered, right? Does it include personal information? Well, yes. Okay, what elements of personal information does the project include? So think back to the scenario. Well, it includes, the details that I've indicated, and then we're thinking about, well, what happens to that information? Okay, the information is ingested by the PHN in some way, and it's used to generate an account. And look, that seems fairly benign, right? That the information is used to generate an account. But also it makes me wonder from a privacy perspective, whether the generation of an account, the holding of a username, a password, an email address, and potentially other details, whether that's actually necessary or not. So just keep that in mind for a moment. I wish that I could to sort of, gauge the room in this virtual environment. And I'm sorry that we can't. But some of you might now be thinking, well, is the creation of an account really necessary? And I want you to hang on to that that thought as we step through this process. But the point here is that the privacy threshold assessment is an opportunity to start to line up your ducks in terms of privacy planning. So you know that personal information is involved. You know that there will be an account creation process involved with that personal information, and that the PHN will need to hang on to that information in order to verify those account holders and provide the free public Wi-Fi service. And the privacy threshold assessment also has you starting to think about whether the project presents significant privacy risks or just, your stock standard ordinary privacy risks, which are still important. And it doesn't change the need to do a privacy impact assessment. What it does, though, is determine whether or not you want to start thinking about doing your internal privacy impact assessment or an external privacy impact assessment. And as I mentioned to Liz earlier, it's that significance of the potential privacy impacts from the lens of the community that you serve that will help to drive that decision. And in this case, our privacy threshold assessment through this scenario is going to indicate that we should be completing an internal privacy impact assessment. So, and this is what I was talking about here. So in the privacy threshold assessment process, personal information is involved, right? We've got name, phone and address, gender, perhaps. Maybe that's something that you've decided you want in order to set up an account. Date of birth, email, password. Date of birth, maybe you're saying to yourselves, oh, well, we need date of birth so we can verify that the individuals setting up the account are over 18. And then, of course, there's the personal information that's associated with using Wi-Fi, such as the user's device details, the day and time of access, the frequency of access, and the location the individual's in while they are receiving that access. And then you can see just on it'll be on the right of your screen, I believe, while you're looking at it, there's an information flow here that is starting to develop, right? So when we talk about what happens to personal information, there's a real opportunity here to start looking at it graphically. So to say, okay, well, we understand that, we have a person attending the location and they're going to set up an account. And to do that, certain information is going to flow through their telco provider and into the PHN. And as you start to see, visualize, I suppose, from a bird's eye view, how the information is going to flow, you also have an opportunity to identify whether there are risks associated with that information flow over time. And then when we talk about whether the project involves significant privacy risks, and remember, this is sort of the catalyst between whether we decide to do an internal privacy impact assessment or we go to an external sort of that objective independent provider. We're looking at details of the project, based on the personal information elements and that's emerging information flow that we have seen. Are we handling large amounts of personal information in this case? Well, yeah, the project proposal seems to be looking at a great deal of personal information for the simple ability for a person to access Wi-Fi. Are we handling sensitive information or health information in this context, or the personal information of vulnerable people? Or are we handling personal information in a way that could have a significant impact on individuals? And while we're proposing to handle large amounts of personal information in this scenario, I wouldn't necessarily consider that the information extends to being sensitive or health information. It may be of vulnerable people, but we don't know that simply from account information. And it's unclear at this point whether there could be a significant impact on individuals. But there are some risk factors that you can look at that help you make that decision or make that, go through that analysis. And this isn't something you have to remember, folks, after training today. All of this information is contained within that privacy threshold assessment checklist. So there's a booklet and some instructions as well as the checklist itself. So please don't feel like you have to write notes furiously or rewatch this training 55 times. this information is available to you in that other format. But there are some activity-based risk factors that are really important to get your mind around, such as, whether you might be disclosing personal information outside of the PHN as part of this process. Now, an example of this would be, and this isn't the case in this proposal, but what if the PHN had decided, just to make things easy for individuals, let's instead of asking people just to create an account, maybe we offer them the ability, to log in to their free public Wi-Fi using their social media accounts, right? Maybe we offer that additional avenue. Then what we potentially have is a back and forth flow of information between the PHN and Facebook or Instagram or whatever the social media account is that the person might prefer to log in through. So while they log in one way, they don't actually see that there's a data transfer or exchange with the social media provider. So maybe in that case, if that were to be the case, then there would be a disclosure outside of the PHN. Similarly, are you proposing as part of the free public Wi-Fi activity to have a down the track data analytics aspect, which might be used to profile particular behavior or make predictions in relation to the community that you serve and their levels of engagement for future projects? Are you going to use any of that personal information for automated decision making relating to the individuals that you are asking to come to the corporate campus and engage with you using that free Wi-Fi service? Or will there be any sort of monitoring or tracking of those community members down the track? So these are some risk factors that you can keep in mind at this very, very early stage of project planning to help you inform what you're going to do in terms of privacy and where those risks might be. So as I said early on, when we first looked at this flow chart, through this case study, we are arriving at a decision to complete an internal privacy impact assessment. And we're doing this because we've determined that there's a significant amount of personal information, but on balance, we probably don't think that the project will cause worry or concern in the community. In fact, we think it'll probably be a great way of increasing community engagement over time. And we don't feel that we are in a position really to need that outside external, privacy oversight or lens. But that we still need to go through a process of good decision making. So in the privacy impact assessment process, which is more formal than the privacy threshold assessment, we're going to look at what the role of personal information will be in the life cycle of the project, what privacy risks arise from that, and what actions can be taken to mitigate those risks or potentially even eliminate those risks. Now, this is really, it's important to understand that I know it probably sounds like a lot, right? Everyone's probably going, oh my gosh, I'm going to need a privacy person full-time in each and every one of my project teams. No, that's not the case. When you have the opportunity to review the privacy threshold assessment checklist, you'll see that it's actually a checklist. It comes with lots of instructions until you get used to using it, but it truly is a tick box exercise. Is this personal information? What types of personal information are we talking about? And on a surface level, how are we proposing this type of information to flow? So please don't feel stressed. Please feel empowered, because what you have now are tools to do privacy better when it comes to that privacy risk assessment. So our privacy impact assessment is going to ask us what the role of personal information is in the project. And it's going to ask us this in a fairly formal way. So first, we're going to be asked to describe our project in detail. So how we talked about that, the scenario is sort of your top line understanding of what the project involves. It's implementing free public Wi-Fi on the corporate PHN campus for the purpose of fostering additional community engagement. right? That's your project. You can do a description that neat and tidy. But then you're going to want to identify who the relevant stakeholders are for that project. So, not just the project team, but all of those individual component parts within the PHN, as well as potentially externally. If, for example, you're involving a vendor in offering your free Wi-Fi, you're involving a telco or some kind of an intermediary like some sort of a platform for hosting your free Wi-Fi. You may also have community groups that may be interested as stakeholders, although they may not be necessarily pivotal for the project. They may be relevant in terms of consultation. So, for example, there might be groups that think, well, if you're going to offer the free public Wi-Fi, you should offer it in an area that is accessible to all members of the community. So you're not going to offer it in a place where there are potentially a lot of stairs or exclusively outdoor areas, because perhaps you may want you may have individuals who are coming onto the campus that are disabled, or that or potentially they may be blind and need to understand where those free Wi-Fi points are in a more accessible manner, and that it's not just sort of about the fact that there will be free Wi-Fi, but that there are stakeholder needs associated with the deployment of a program like that could be ancillary to privacy, but still really relevant in terms of the community that you're serving. And then you're going to identify formally the personal information that you propose for the project. So, at the privacy threshold assessment stage, we said, okay, well, we think we might want to use the following types of personal information, or that the following personal information will be involved in some way. The privacy impact assessment asks you to set that out formally. So it's at a point where you've made some decisions as a project, or you're about to make some decisions as a project. And then you want to map how that personal information is going to move. So from the individual into the PHN, around the PHN, and potentially externally to the PHN. And you want to know whether or not from that privacy threshold assessment process into the formal now impact assessment process, there have been any changes to your original understanding of what's going to happen to that personal information. So the example that I used before about whether maybe you decide, someone has the bright idea of allowing people to log in using their social media and not just through setting up an account. Well, you've in effect changed the information flow by making that additional decision or that additional functionality potentially available. So I want to talk about a couple of privacy risks just to give you a sense of how this works in practice. So before, when we talked about the amount of personal information that was potentially going to be collected, we talked about different types of elements of personal information, like a person's name and their email address, their date of birth, their gender, etc. So privacy principles ask us to consider whether what we are collecting is necessary to achieve our purpose, and whether or not it is excessive for fulfilling that purpose. So one of the privacy risks that may arise out of the privacy impact assessment process will be if you answer yes to question 2 in your privacy impact assessment checklist, which is all personal information collected necessary to achieve the identified purpose? So if you answer yes, that's fantastic, right? So if you think that date of birth is necessary to achieve the purpose, I will just ask you to think again, because it potentially isn't, right? There are many ways, for example, to determine whether or not a person is, in an age category that is acceptable to access your free public Wi-Fi. So maybe instead of asking for date of birth, you could just ask for an age range of an individual, between ages 10 and 20, 10 and 18, 18 and over, for example. That may be enough to satisfy you without actually asking for a person's date of birth for account purposes. So if you answer no, then this is telling you have a potential privacy risk here that you need to deal with. So for example, over collection of personal information, right? That's excessive for the purposes of the project. And if you answer no, what you're saying as well is potentially that personal information is being collected just in case, that it is potentially expedient or useful for your purposes, or potentially for purposes down the track in terms of data analytics or understanding of behavior of the community that you serve. But if you're collecting it just because it's useful or expedient, or potentially because the technology that you're proposing to use, the platform you're proposing to use, allows the collection of certain elements of personal information as part of sort of their standard platform configurations, there may be a bit of work for you to do there. So just highlighting that as collection as one of those areas that a privacy impact assessment will help you get into more and potentially help you refine those elements of personal information that you need in order to, legitimately offer a free public Wi-Fi service to the community. But also we have, 43 questions later, another area where privacy risk might come up. And these certainly aren't the only two by any stretch, but this is just to give you an idea. Whenever you're doing something like the offering of free public Wi-Fi, the chances of that being something that you build in-house and offer on premises, in a purpose-built manner without the involvement of any external vendors, the chances of that happening are actually really low. So you need to ask yourself the question about what's happening in that vendor or service provider space. And in our privacy laws, both at the Commonwealth level, where you have the general privacy requirements, you also have your health privacy requirements that may be relevant in this case in terms of what service providers must agree to before they're able to handle personal information on your behalf. So one of the questions in a privacy impact assessment is, have reasonable steps been taken to bind the external service provider to an agreement that requires them to comply with the APPs and where relevant, the health privacy principles? And at this stage, particularly if you're still in those early stages of project planning, you may not have taken those steps yet. So it would be reasonable to suggest or to recommend that there's room for improvement in terms of that vendor management, of that vendor relationship. Your potential privacy risk here is that if an external provider is not adequately bound, contractually to comply with the privacy rules, you're going to be on the hook for what they do in their environment with the personal information that they've collected on your behalf. And that's pretty scary, particularly if you're using potentially an off-the-shelf service provider where you go online and you agree to their terms and conditions, but you don't really have any say in their personal information management processes contractually otherwise. So that's also something to keep in mind. So now then, once we've identified what our potential privacy risks are, we have an opportunity to really, drag them through that level of assessment that I've just been doing around, okay, well, maybe there are alternatives or other options here that we can explore. So in terms of that first area of privacy concern around over collection of personal information, the recommendation would be that the project should avoid collecting unnecessary personal information. So is it possible to allow users to connect to the Wi-Fi without setting up an account or without collecting personal information for the purpose? And then also considering what personal information relating to connection and usage of Wi-Fi is necessary for you to have. So one is, do they need to set up an account in the first place, or can they just click and join? And second is, in the event that you're going to be collecting that background information about their Wi-Fi usage, how much of that is really necessary for you? And you may find that some of it is necessary for you because you want to understand, say, the extent of time that the community is staying on campus, using your free public Wi-Fi, and how often during those periods they are engaging with your community initiatives. You may actually need to know that information for the purposes of your project, but you need to do that analysis. And then in terms of the discussion that I just had around privacy risk around vendors, it will be really important that you arrive at a recommendation that relates to the privacy and information security requirements of your service provider. So you'll want to have in that contract documentation, for example, some specific clauses around privacy and security, and potentially also data breach management. So if something happens on their end, what are they going to do about it? How are they going to notify you, and when? And then what procedure or process will you follow, moving on from there internally. Now, once you've done all of that work, and you've done your risk assessment, you've done your recommendations in order to help mitigate those risks, the next stage then is deciding how you're going to implement those recommendations, how you're going to action them. So maybe there's a need to provide particular individuals with responsibilities and a timeline for actioning those recommendations before the project can go forward. And then also you're going to want to talk about after implementation, when are you going to do your sense check to see if the project has changed over time and whether there are additional privacy risks that may need to be mitigated. So that is your privacy risk assessment process in a nutshell. And I know that that was a whole lot for everybody to digest, but I'm hoping that that particular case study illustrated for you that on something as benign, you would think, as free public Wi-Fi, there are actually a lot of considerations that relate to privacy and the handling of personal information within Gippsland PHN that need to be considered before those projects get the green light. So with that, Liz, I'll turn over to you if there are any final questions.
Sure, thank you. There's a great question around considering how we conduct a threshold assessment. We have a data asset registry where we have where staff have logged where they have a data set or other documents with personal information, but that's only one slice potentially of the overall project. So would we conduct a threshold assessment on that one data set, or would we conduct a threshold assessment on the broader project?
So I think in terms of the practicalities of running an organization like Gippsland PHN, the project itself is the thing that you do the privacy impact assessment on, taking account or consideration of the various data sets that you have collected for your functions, or that you need to collect for your functions. So where a project is proposing to collect a new data set, for example, that should be triggering right away that the privacy threshold assessment process will apply. But you can, if you have in your registry of data assets, some concern that you have data that has been collected, but you're not really sure for what purpose, that you have it because it might be useful or expedient generally broadly for the organization. There may be relevance having a look at your data holdings from that broader organizational privacy governance perspective and doing a PIA on how you conduct your data gathering activities broadly, generally. That would be an awesome privacy impact assessment project, but conducting a PIA on each and every data set or asset within the register, what that may present for you is a challenge in where to go next. So, and these are decisions for you as an organization, but from a strategic privacy management perspective, it's you have an obligation under law already to only collect the personal information that you need for the functions of the PHN. And that when you collect it, you need to manage it in such a way that it is secure and protected for its life cycle. We often have a data asset register in order to allow ourselves to know where our personal information is held so that we can protect it and so that we can identify it at times when we're looking at doing projects that may involve aspects of that particular data collection or all of that particular data collection. Have I answered that question?
Yes,
for
thank
you,
you.
Liz?
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely.
Okay.
It's just gone 2:00. We did have another question, but I actually think that's probably an internal question that we can answer anyway. So I thank you, Nicole, for that wonderful presentation. There's lots of information there, and it has been a real talk fest. So good on you for managing, and thank you everyone for persisting with it. And I think it'll start to make sense as we roll out some of the actual how-to stuff in the next few weeks. So
I think so.
Look out for more. Yeah.
And Liz, I think my parting remark there would just be that we've talked about a lot today. The most important thing for everyone in today's training was to understand the framing for privacy in Gippsland PHN and to understand why there is this aspect of governance that is so important for staff to be conscious of in their project management. The documentation itself sets out the processes in a really easy to understand and digestible way. So please don't anyone go away feeling terrified by this or overwhelmed by this, because it's sensible and it's easy, I promise.
Excellent. On that note, thank you, Nicole, and thanks to the rest of the IIS team, and thank you everyone for your participation, and we'll say farewell.
Thank you, everyone.